Across the dry plains of southern India in 1876, the monsoon clouds gathered as they always had, building along the horizon with the promise of relief. Farmers waited for the first heavy drops that would soften the soil and begin the planting season. Instead, the sky held back. Days passed. Then weeks. The earth hardened beneath the sun, wells shrank, and the first signs of scarcity appeared in village markets. What began as a delayed monsoon soon unfolded into one of the deadliest famines of the 19th century. By the time the crisis reached its peak, millions across British India would face starvation, displacement, and disease in a catastrophe now remembered as the Great Madras Famine. In the late 19th century, southern India formed a crucial part of British India, administered under the authority of the British Raj. The region known as the Madras Presidency stretched across much of present-day Tamil Nadu, parts of Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and Kerala. It was home to tens of millions of people, most of whom relied directly on agriculture. Seasonal monsoon rains determined whether harvests succeeded or failed. For generations, local farming communities had adapted to the rhythms of this climate. Tanks, irrigation channels, and traditional grain storage helped buffer the effects of poor rainfall. But by the 1870s, economic conditions had shifted. Colonial taxation policies demanded fixed land revenue payments from cultivators regardless of harvest outcomes. At the same time, expanding railway networks and export markets increasingly connected Indian agriculture to global trade. Grain moved across regions and toward overseas markets, sometimes leaving vulnerable areas with limited reserves. The crisis began with the failure of the southwest monsoon in 1876. Rainfall across much of southern India dropped dramatically. Crops withered in the fields, and the autumn harvest failed across wide stretches of the Deccan Plateau. Livestock weakened as grazing lands dried, and fodder grew scarce. At first, the scale of the disaster was not fully understood. Local shortages had occurred before, and officials expected conditions to stabilize when the next seasonal rains arrived. But the following monsoon also failed in many areas. By late 1876 and early 1877, food supplies in large parts of the Madras Presidency and the neighboring Bombay Presidency had sharply declined. As grain became scarce, prices rose rapidly in local markets. For wealthier households, the increase meant higher expenses. For agricultural laborers and small farmers already living close to subsistence, it meant something far more severe. Their wages could no longer purchase enough food to survive. Reports from district officials described villages where families began selling livestock, tools, and household possessions in order to buy grain. When those resources were exhausted, many people left their homes in search of food or work elsewhere. Roads and railway stations filled with migrants moving toward larger towns where they hoped relief might be available. At the center of the colonial administration during this period was Robert Bulwer-Lytton. His government faced the challenge of responding to a disaster unfolding across a vast territory. British officials had long debated how famine relief should be managed. Some argued that large-scale intervention risked encouraging dependency or disrupting market systems. Others believed that rapid relief was essential to prevent widespread suffering. Early responses relied heavily on the assumption that grain markets would correct shortages if trade continued without interference. Railways were expected to move food from surplus regions into areas of scarcity. Yet in practice, high prices meant that many starving communities could not afford the grain that reached local markets. By early 1877, the humanitarian crisis had become impossible to ignore. Relief camps and public works programs were established across parts of southern India. People who were able to work could receive small wages or food rations in exchange for labor on infrastructure projects such as road construction and irrigation works. These relief efforts were guided partly by principles that had developed in earlier British famine policy. Administrators attempted to provide assistance while maintaining strict limits intended to prevent misuse of resources. Rations were calculated according to standardized guidelines, and workers in relief camps were often required to perform physically demanding labor to qualify for support. For many individuals weakened by hunger, these conditions were extremely difficult to endure. Contemporary observers noted that large numbers of migrants arrived at relief centers already suffering from exhaustion and illness after long journeys in search of assistance. The famine expanded across an enormous geographic area. In addition to the Madras Presidency and Bombay Presidency, severe shortages affected the princely state of Hyderabad state and portions of Mysore Kingdom. Across these regions, agricultural production had collapsed after consecutive monsoon failures. Drought alone did not explain the full scale of the disaster. The global climate pattern known today as El Niño has since been associated with the severe weather conditions of the late 1870s. El Niño events can disrupt monsoon patterns across South Asia, and modern research suggests that the climatic disturbances of 1876 to 1878 were among the strongest recorded in the 19th century. As the drought continued into 1877, food insecurity deepened. Malnutrition weakened large populations, leaving them vulnerable to disease outbreaks that often accompany famine conditions. Illnesses such as cholera and malaria spread through overcrowded camps and migrating populations. Colonial records from the period document the immense logistical challenges faced by administrators attempting to coordinate relief across thousands of miles. Railways transported grain shipments from northern India and Burma, while relief expenditures gradually increased as the crisis intensified. Yet critics at the time, and many historians since, have argued that the response was too slow and too limited for a famine of such magnitude. Some economic historians have pointed to the continued export of grain from India during the early phases of the famine as evidence that market priorities sometimes overshadowed humanitarian needs. Public debate in Britain and India grew more intense as reports from the famine-stricken regions circulated through newspapers and official correspondence. Missionaries, journalists, and relief workers described widespread displacement and suffering among rural communities. By mid-1877, the British government expanded relief operations significantly. Large public works projects employed hundreds of thousands of workers. Grain depots distributed rations in the worst affected districts. Charitable organizations and local rulers also contributed resources to aid relief efforts. The princely state of Mysore Kingdom, for example, organized extensive relief programs under its own administration. Similar initiatives appeared in other princely territories, demonstrating how responses to famine varied across the political landscape of colonial India. Despite these measures, the scale of the catastrophe remained immense. Agricultural production had collapsed across multiple harvest seasons, and recovery required more than a single year of improved rainfall. Many farming households had lost livestock, seeds, and tools necessary to restart cultivation. Migration continued throughout the famine years. Railway stations, roads, and relief camps became gathering points for displaced populations seeking food and employment. Cities such as Madras saw large numbers of migrants arriving from surrounding rural districts. Weather patterns finally began to improve in 1878 as monsoon rains returned to many areas of southern India. Fields that had remained barren for months slowly began to produce crops again. Relief camps gradually closed as agricultural activity resumed. Yet the famine's impact extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Estimates of mortality vary widely among historians, but many scholars believe that between 5 and 8 million people died across the affected regions during the famine years of 1876 to 1878. These deaths resulted not only from starvation but also from the diseases that often accompany prolonged food shortages and displacement. In the aftermath, the British administration conducted extensive inquiries into the causes and management of the famine. One of the most significant outcomes was the development of a formal system of famine codes. These guidelines aimed to create clearer procedures for identifying food shortages and launching relief operations before conditions reached catastrophic levels. The Indian Famine Commission played a central role in shaping these reforms. Its reports examined agricultural vulnerability, transportation networks, grain supply systems, and the responsibilities of government during food crises. The resulting policies emphasized early detection of crop failure, improved data collection on food prices and rainfall, and faster mobilization of relief resources when warning signs appeared. While these reforms did not eliminate famine from colonial India, they influenced how later administrations approached food security and disaster response. The Great Madras Famine also reshaped public understanding of environmental risk and governance across the subcontinent. Communities that had long depended on predictable monsoon patterns now confronted the reality that global climate fluctuations could disrupt entire agricultural systems. At the same time, debates over the famine highlighted tensions within the political structure of British India. Questions about taxation, grain trade, and the responsibilities of colonial authorities became part of broader discussions about economic policy and political accountability. For historians, the famine remains one of the most significant humanitarian crises of the 19th century. It unfolded at the intersection of climate variability, colonial governance, global markets, and rural vulnerability. Each of these forces contributed to a disaster that reshaped policy and memory across South Asia. In villages across southern India, the famine years left enduring marks on family histories and regional economies. Fields that had once supported thriving farming communities required years to recover. Some families never returned to their original homes, having migrated permanently in search of more stable livelihoods. Today, the Great Madras Famine stands as a reminder of how environmental shocks can interact with political and economic systems to produce devastating consequences. It also underscores the importance of early warning systems, public infrastructure, and coordinated relief in responding to large-scale food crises. The monsoon that failed in 1876 began as a quiet absence in the sky. But its consequences unfolded across millions of lives, transforming a seasonal disruption into one of the deadliest famines in modern Indian history.